Okay, so we are having a course instruction tonight on case statement and how it relates to grant writing. And we're going to go through this in quite a bit of detail. And we're recording that, so we'll always have, excuse me, always have that for posterity. So I'm going to share my screen. And I have created a document, a blank case statement form that would be filled out. And it is going to be a tool that you would use over and over. But I've put some introductory comments at the front of the form. And I'm going to go through this fairly slowly, Aaron. And you stop me if you have any questions, okay?
All right.
So the document actually says at the top in big letters, organizational information, because you're trying to capture a whole bunch of information about the organization for which you're writing a grant. So it's not actually called the case statement, but that's what it is. So it's in Microsoft Word, and the Word document is called the blank case statement form. But to introduce that form, I call the title of it organizational information. And then it says, in fundraising through grant seeking, this form is called the case statement. It asks all the questions a typical funder will ask on a grant application. It gets its name from being the statement making the case for giving to our organization. So you're trying to convince them to give to the organization, and you're wanting them to give through a grant, and they're going to ask you a ton of questions on their application. The bigger the amount of money, the bigger the funder, the typically a private foundation or whoever it is, the bigger they are, the more questions it's going to be, the more complicated it's going to be. If you're just going to a wealthy person and asking them to write you a check, you're not having to fill out any application for that. They're doing it based on a relationship. But this is because you have no relationship with that organization, so they want you to prove your merit and make your case of why they should give to you. So that's why it's called a case statement. You're making your case. But they get to pick the questions, right? They don't want to hear a sales pitch from you. They don't want to hear a marketing pitch. They want you to answer the questions that they've decided need to be answers that would prove that you're fit for their particular grant.
Okay.
About 75% of these answers will be easily identified. The other 25%, it's like, what's your address? What's your phone number? Really straightforward stuff. Stuff that's already known, stuff that's concrete. Those are the easy answers. The other 25% will require the organization to, quote, wrestle with the answer to define things that are important for the funders to know, but that the organization has never had to define before. So that happened with your mom. There was a bunch of stuff on here that she didn't know what the answer would be. And she really struggled with that. But I said, you have to wrestle with that. They're going to ask you this question. You better know the answer. You better have thought that through, even if you really have to struggle and sweat and think, what's the answer? And we'll talk about some of those as we go along. And then I put a note in here. Usually the harder answers don't have to be defined at the beginning. In other words, the organization doesn't have to have a particular answer until a prospective funder asks that question on a grant application. So if we have a question that you don't know the answer to, and we're just going to use Changing Chains as our sample organization tonight, okay? But this applies to anybody. If there's a question on here like, what are your strategic goals, right? Just some esoteric question like that, and you don't have a list of strategic goals, well, you ought to eventually, but you really don't have to worry about that until you encounter a grant application that says, what are your strategic goals? Because they don't all say that, right? Some will, some won't. So you could have a fairly complicated question with a complicated answer, but you can defer answering it until it actually comes up on an application. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Then here's an advanced grant writing tip. And can you see this on your screen? Are you pulled over yet where you can see this or not?
I can see the sheet you were showing me earlier. Legal name.
Yeah.
Mailing
Okay.
address.
I can make it a little bigger too now that you're trying to see it. Let me zoom in a little bit. How's that?
That's better.
Let me see if I can do a little more here.
So I can read everything,
Okay.
even the smaller print.
Yeah. Okay. So here's a note called advanced grant writing. Also note that you will encounter a unique question from time to time, rarely, that is not on this form. The prospective funder will ask an off-the-wall question that may be important to them, but is not something the organization has ever dealt with before. You always have the choice of answering not applicable, in other words, not giving them an answer, because it's some weird question, like how many Eskimos did you serve last year, or whatever, just some crazy thing, that nobody else has ever asked. You can say not applicable, but remember that could weaken your application request if that question is important to the prospective funder. So one-off weird questions do come up every once in a while. We cannot anticipate those, and you just have to stop and think about that. And if and a lot of times, Aaron, you're filling out these applications online on a website, right? And
That's
they
what I thought.
program it to either be mandatory or optional, right? If it's got a little red star by that field, you've got to answer it, or the formal process, right? So sometimes the weird questions are not mandatory, they're optional. So you could just skip them, right? If it's some weird question, but it's not required, which is you hope that's the case, just skip it. But if it's required and it's weird, then which might happen 1 in 100, right? You might encounter this. You're going to have to stop and figure out what's the answer. So if you're the grant writer for an organization, you don't have to make up the answer. You have to go back to whoever your overseer is and say, hey, I've got a question I've never seen here before. It's got, where I don't know the answer. What's the answer to this question? And they'll be like, we have no idea. You're like, well, if you want this grant application to go through, you're going to have to come up with a reasonable answer that I can put in there so the thing will process. See, so that I'm just mentioning that doesn't happen very often, but hopefully that makes sense. I wanted to document that for future reference. It can happen. All right. So I'm just going to start walking down through these fields here. Most of them are self-explanatory. Legal name, mailing address, physical address. And again, this information is in a Word document, Aaron, and you get it all keyed in the right way so you can copy and paste it into a website. You're not having to retype it or think it up every time. You figure it out, you put it in here, and then you copy and paste it. And so it makes grant writing so much easier. This is really, I forgot to say this in the beginning, but this is really the core of my approach. If you'll do this, if you'll fill this document out one time and keep it, make it very precise and specific, and then keep it updated, then grant writing is so much easier downstream. Okay. So legal name, mailing address, physical address, if it's different, main phone number, main email address, website address, date incorporated, or also called date founded, your fiscal year. Do you end your fiscal year of your accounting on December 31st or whatever? These are questions that they put. It's very common for them to ask this. Okay. They're kind of quantifying the specifics about your nonprofit. Your FEIN number, your federal employer identification number. Anybody who's registered with the IRS to have an identity at all that already exists, you'd be surprised how many people are like, well, we don't know. I'm like, well, you have one and you better get it because it's required. So it's good to get that. That's
how do you get that? You go back to the IRS and find it?
Well, okay, so they have one. If you incorporate, basically one of the things they make you do is get a FEIN number.
Oh,
Everybody's got
so but
nonprofits,
it's just
businesses, churches, everybody's got
I
one.
got it. It's like an EIN number, just what they
Yeah,
got
yeah,
you.
it's an EIN number. They just some people call it FEIN because it's federal.
Yeah, I got you.
So I'll put that on here just to make that clear. Come on. Anyway, so you can't if you can't find it, if you lost it, you can go online and request that they send you the form again. You know, like the confirmation letter, whatever. It's free. You know, it's just a
Yeah.
hassle, and that's something
So
people should have that stuff in their files. They should, but sometimes they don't. Okay.
so they don't get that necessarily from the state like you will an LLC or
No,
EIN.
this is federal. This is federal. It's from the IRS. Okay. Then number of full-time employees, number of part-time employees, number of volunteers.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are pieces of data, right? Next, number 13 is history of the organization. That's going to be a paragraph, right? You need to write out a good history of the organization. And this is where it gets tricky because sometimes they'll say on the online web application, it'll say limit 150 words or limit 100 or 1,500 characters or something like that. But if you've written a history of the organization and you put it here and it's 3,000 characters and they say limit 1,500 characters, that's where the work comes in because you've written a good history, but then it's too long. And you've got to sit there in the moment and trim that thing down. And that's tricky, right? So in advanced grant writing, I actually recommend on some of these having a short version, a medium version, and a long version because if they have room, if they say 5,000 characters or 2,000 words in this box will fit, you ought to be able to say a bunch. You want to have the longer version. But if they give you like, well, say all this in 25 words or less, then you're screwed and you need a short version. So that's kind of tricky because every one of them's different. Every funder has got a different length of the answer. And so it's kind of a balancing act, but you want to just write a paragraph or two and hopefully that'll be thorough and sufficient. Does that make sense?
So I just gather information from them.
Right.
They hopefully have a description of their organization's history.
Right. Yeah, it would be a paragraph or two, how they started, what year they started, what they were thinking when they started, whatever, And so they provide that to you. You store it in this answer, and then you only have a challenge if you're later on doing a grant application and the answer that they gave you is longer than what fits in the box. Because the box has like a limited number of characters. It'll tell you, it'll say, 1,500 characters only. And then you copy and paste yours in there and you're at 1,600, it'll come up and say, you got too many letters in here. You got to trim it down. And they won't advance. That grant application will not advance unless you get everything in compliance. Is that, do I need to show you like an example of that or are you getting that?
No, I get it.
Okay.
I just had to make sure that the information, like, was I writing this, making it up for these people?
Right.
Or were they providing their own?
I mean, theoretically, you like facilitate them providing it. And they're like, well, we've never written a history of our organization before. You're like, well, you need to. And you got to hold them accountable because you can't complete this document until they write the answer to each one of these questions. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
You can facilitate that. You can give them hints. You can give them suggestions. But at the end of the day, they've got to write it.
Yeah, that's right.
Unless it's because that could already exist on their website or someplace. You just go copy and paste. If it already exists somewhere electronically, you're golden. Now, It may be outdated and they may want to review it and update it. But, if it already exists, just copy and paste it in there. If they've never thought of that particular thing before, then they're going to have to stop and create that. Okay. So organizational description. So the next few that we're going to go through, for example, your mom, she had a hard time telling the difference between these. And I'm going to try to make it clear. And that's why we're recording this, because to me, they seem very distinct and separate. But to somebody who's new, they're like, well, what's the difference between a mission statement and a vision statement?
Sure.
They're different, but I want to make sure we're clear on all this. I've tried to make it clear. But sometimes they'll ask for an organizational description in one sentence. So you've got to come up with a, good, like it could be a long, it could be a long sentence, but it needs to be a sentence. Okay. Program descriptions. If I've worked with organizations that had like 3 or 4 major programs, okay, that's hard to manage all that data because you really need a summary or overview statement about each program and then details about each program. Like, we got a children's program, we got an adult program, we got a homeless program. You better have descriptions of all those because they're going to, the funder is going to expect you to have good answers on that. You better be able to describe your programs. And sometimes they ask for it in summary and sometimes they ask for it detail. You better have both. So that's some work. There's some work. Organizations have to have the discipline to sit down and define their programs. You can't just be running this stuff from the seat of your pants and then expect a funder to respect that. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
You better write that stuff down. So there'll be time spent putting together the program descriptions. Statement of need. A lot of times they'll ask for a statement of need. That's a little vague for people sometimes. In other words, the way that you come up with that though is the question is, so what? Right? So what if your changing change didn't exist? What if your organization didn't even exist? Who cares? What would be the difference? Right? What's the need, the unique need that you guys are filling? And it's good to have a statement of need that's clear because it justifies your existence and makes you stand out from other organizations. If there's 20 food pantries in your community, they don't need 21 food pantries necessarily, right? I mean, if it's just redundant and non-unique, you want to state clearly the specific needs you're meeting and why you do that in a special way. So that's a statement of need. Ready for the next one?
Yep.
Okay, so vision statement. Vision statement always starts off with, we envision a future where ... Okay, you want a vision statement to be something very specific. You say we have a vision that if we do what we're doing, the community will be better, right? There'll be less crime, or there'll be more school programs, or there'll be more jobs, or whatever. You want to state what your vision is for the future and why you're doing what you're doing. Okay, that's different than a mission statement. A mission statement is typically one sentence. You distill it down what you're doing, not the why, but the what. How you're carrying out the how and the what of what you carry out your mission. Okay, we serve our community by having programs, by feeding kids, by helping. You take your mission and you distill that into one sentence. I'm going to put that on here. Actually, it's very important. Not some big long thing, because your mission statement is really what you get. It's like your rallying cry that everybody in your organization should have it memorized. What are we here for? We're here because we are called of God to solve the poverty of this community, or whatever it is. It needs to be the rallying cry of your organization. So when somebody asks, some funder or some visitor or whoever comes in the door says, what do y'all do here? You better have that good answer ready to pop it out. Your mission statement should be the first thing out. You better be clear on your mission. If not, it's a dysfunctional organization. Okay. Next one, organizational values statement. A lot of times I ask you, what are your values, right? And well, we value integrity. We value this. It can be fairly generic, but if that's a question on a grant application that's mandatory, you better have a good answer. Even if it's 4 or 5 generic values, you better have something to put in there. And in changing change case, they had your mom gave me a whole list of values that they specific values that the organization had already thought of. They already had that, so that was easy. Just copy and paste it right in there. Okay, statement of purpose. Sometimes people ask for a statement of purpose. The best I can describe that, I put here, this is an expanded version of the mission statement to be used when the funder gives lots of room, for example, 1,500 characters, for the mission statement, or asks statement of purpose. Okay, so it's you elaborating on your mission more than one sentence. Hopefully that's clear, because sometimes they ask for that. And this is the hardest one right here, number 21. So let me just take a breath. We doing okay, Aaron? You following along good?
Yep.
Okay, just interrupt me if there's any questions. So number 21, in my opinion, has been the hardest one for people to deal with because that funder is going to say, what is the purpose or description of the grant request? In other words, specifically, what money are you asking for and why are you asking for it? And typically, grant requests fall into two categories. We're asking for general funding just to operate with, or we're asking you to fund a specific project. Like we're going to have a banquet and we need to provide meals for 1,500 poor people or something like that. So it's either a programs or project specific request or general operating funds. Okay. But you need to be clear on that. You need to be able to articulate, here's the money we're asking for. It's this amount, and this is what we're asking for it to go for. Okay. For some reason, people have the hardest time saying that. They just want somebody to give them some money without any explanation, right? It doesn't work like that. And then sometimes they'll ask you to provide a budget of where that money's going, kind of like we saw in that prison fellowship proposal that I did. They wanted to see, how much money you're asking for and how's that broken down by budget categories. Okay. So it can be very specific and people need to have a good answer for that. That's going to vary from funder to funder. You can't just write that one time. Okay. That one, I mean, if you're asking for general operating funds, that's the same every time. Just say, well, we're not asking for anything specific. Just we need money to run our organization because we have administration costs, we have salary costs, we have expenses, for our programs, blah, blah, blah. You can have a general statement if you're just asking for general funds. But if you have a specific program and the funder is asking for specifics, you're going to have to kind of do that in the moment. You're going to have to word that to meet their requirements and your need both at the same time. That's the hardest one right there. Yeah, and you'll get better. I mean, when I started, that was hard for me. You get better at it over time. Okay. Moving on. 22 geographic areas served. If you serve a particular city, town, zip code, geographic area, however you define that, state, the whole nation, whatever it is, you got to just put that in there. And then community demographics, also called population served. Well, we serve women with kids, school-age kids, or we serve veterans, or we serve geriatric, senior citizens, whatever it is. If you have a specific demographic that you serve, you put that in there. If you just say we help everybody at some level, like a food pantry is for everybody, then you say that too. They want to know who you're serving. Now here's an option. Go ahead.
On that who you serving, that'll, like, somebody can be, I just serve the community nearest me, the community at hand.
Okay, you broke up a little bit. Say that again.
They can say something like, I serve the community.
Yeah, our organization just serves everybody in the community. Yeah. What if it's that general, then put that in there.
So there's no wrong or right answer for this.
Right. It just needs to be, but make it as specific as possible. Because if you're just serving, at-risk kids, we put at-risk kids in our local community or something. Try to quantify it as much as possible.
Give like an age determination or something.
Yeah, you can. I mean, you can do by race, by age, by zip code. We're serving at-risk kids and, zip code 76108 between the ages of, 8 and 15. If that's in fact descriptive of your program, you want to put that in there. And a lot of times they'll spell it out for you. It'll almost be like fields you check. You'll check this, or do you have this or not? Sometimes it's a paragraph. Sometimes it's little click buttons that you would select from their range of answers. Okay. Past successes, that's optional. I don't see that asked for very often. I'm surprised they don't ask that more. But if you wanted to begin to accumulate past successes like statistics, highlights, metrics, testimonies, and then client testimonials is also optional. Make that red here. It never hurts to have 2 or 3 client testimonials. Also, volunteer testimonials are great. Like, oh, I love working at this organization because I get to help people and it's changed my life. And, so both of those are very strong to help your proposal. And if they ask for it, great. Sometimes, though, Aaron, there'll be a field at the bottom that says upload a document here with any additional information you think would help us understand your grant application. So if you get the opportunity to upload generic, add additional stuff, then testimonials are a great thing to put out there if you have them. Okay, so number of volunteers, we've already asked that once. I'm going to delete that. How that got in there. But then we want to know, they'll ask volunteer roles and number of hours. So that gets asked. I think that's on almost every application. What are the volunteers doing and how many hours a week or month or whatever are they doing it? Like, we've got a volunteer bookkeeper who works 3 hours a week, whatever. You got to break that down. They want to see each role in the number of hours. That's very common for them to ask for that. So you better go find that out, right? You better have that already in your little case statement here, so you could just copy and paste it in. You don't have to go do that every time. You've already thought of that. You've already captured that information ahead. That's being smart on grant writing. Okay, strategic goals is optional. A lot of times they talk about outcomes. And boy, some organizations have that well defined and some have no idea. But they just want to help people. Well, we're just helping people. We're giving people their GED or whatever. But the outcome is the community is better educated or whatever. And so that's an advanced topic in grant writing and in fundraising and in nonprofits. And so they really need to have a logic model of what they do. And if they have gone through and developed a logic model, which you don't have to do, but it helps them define their outcomes. And I do that. I help nonprofits develop logic models. And it's very helpful. It just shows your inputs, your processes, your outputs, your metrics, your outcomes, all this stuff comes popping out. But it's really probably the question that most nonprofits get on grant applications that they have the hardest time with. If they don't have clear outcomes already defined, they scramble trying to come up with that in a way that meets the funder's expectation on that application. And it's a little advanced, it's a little complicated. But you just, as a grant writer, you're just saying, tell me your outcomes, because they're asking for that, right? And they may be saying, we don't know, but that's their problem, not your problem. If there's a grant that you really want and it requires the outcomes question to be answered, then somebody's going to have to sit down and develop some outcomes to be able to fill in that application. So I'm just giving you a heads up. That can be something people have to wrestle with. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. A sustainability plan. I see this. I had to do quite a bit of research the first time I hit this question. And they basically say, will the project proceed if you do not raise the full amount of money, or if we don't give you some money? Well, how are you going to do this project, right? You better have a good answer for that. And typically it's like, well, we have other donors, we have other sources of funding, we have a good plan, we have a good board, we've hired a grant writer, whatever. You better have a plan for getting funding, right? They just want to see that if they give you this money and then you spend it all, is everything going to quit, or is it going to carry on? Is it sustainable? How are you sustaining your organization, and how are you sustaining your project? Okay. So that's typically fairly common in nonprofit world. People should have that pretty well already figured out. Some applications are going to require, some funders going to say, tell us your sustainability plan or else we're not giving you money. Okay. So then right there, you're going to have, not you, but you have to encourage your client or the organization to develop that. And then a lot of times they'll ask for a list of major donors. Like they'll say, tell us the top 10 donors who gave to your organization last year, or just tell us your major donors, or show us a list of all the grants you've ever received. There's all these specialized requests. You can't define that ahead of time. You have to answer that in the moment, because every application asks for it differently. That's when you really can't necessarily answer once and for all, because you don't know how they're going to ask it. But you can be thinking about it. You can just list your top 10 donors or something like that if you wanted to. But usually that happens in the moment as you're on the fly, you're developing that application, because they're going to, like I said, they're going to ask for it in a specific way, like attach an Excel spreadsheet that shows blah, 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 right? They're going to be very specific about how you report that. And you just have to do that, as part of the project, because you can't write that ahead of time. Okay.
So basically,
We made
So
through all
basically,
of those pretty quickly. That's pretty good.
they'll open up a spreadsheet, will document their list of donors and maybe how much they've given.
Right. And they'll tell you what they want to see, like just the names of the organizations or who's given in the last year, or how much they gave, or blah, blah, blah. Rank them, greatest to least, whatever they want, they'll tell you that in the application.
And when you say logic model, you just mean like graphs, right? If not graphs, something that depicts data.
Well, let me see if I can find a logic model and show you what I mean. It's a picture of the organization done. All right, here's the one for my old project. Let me stop sharing. Share a different screen. Oh, there it is. So that, my friend, is a logic model. And it's pretty involved. Okay. So it shows the assumptions that you make about your program. Like there's people coming home from prison and there's people in poverty, whatever your assumptions are. And then the inputs it takes, like money, staff, all the inputs, the activities that you carry out in your program, the outputs that you produce, the outcomes, which is different than outputs, and then the impacts in the community. And I could talk you through all that, but we don't have time tonight. It's pretty involved. But once you've thought that through, you've defined in totality what it is that program does. And you can communicate. When you have a logic model, man, people are so impressed with that. And it's so easy to pull out because they'll say, well, what are your outputs or what are your outcomes or what are your impacts? And you've already got it all figured out, right? You've defined that for the universe, to see this is what we do. So it's really precedes good grant writing. You should always, and really to be a good nonprofit, to have any sort of offering in the community, you should have already thought this stuff through. Most people don't, but they should. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying you understand all that. I'm just saying, do you understand the general purpose of it?
Yeah, it's just to put on paper what you guys say y'all do.
Right. And with some good, clear details and written in fairly simple language too, You don't want to be too academic. Okay, so let me wrap up here. Once you've answered all these questions, there's a process to follow with all this information. Job one is to make sure that your answers are well worded and refined with as many revisions as needed. I mean, you don't need to have any typos or any of that stuff here. It needs to have good grammar, good, clear sentences, blah, 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 because you're going to use these over and over. They become really the standard language of your organization. You're really, you're thinking things through once and for all, hopefully. Number two, next, make sure that the wording is the accurate representative of your organization and have your board of directors approve that wording because you're going to the marketplace. This is what we're saying about what we do, whether it's on a grant application or a website or wherever. You want that wording to be well thought out and clearly stated. Okay. And then number three, thinking these things through will force the organization's leadership to refine its language. Oops. And which will help other projects like a website or brochure or whatever. Number four, this document really needs to be kept up to date, reviewed regularly, and made the heart or core of all organizational communications, especially grant applications. Ta-da!
So on the grant application, that's like most of it's online, bubble
Right.
in or whatever. So basically I use this as an outline in case anything comes up that's not on the outline. I make the phone call, send the email, send the text messages, reach the client I'm working for in order to gather more information.
Right. And
So
say,
I'm just
hey, and you send them the question. I've got this weird question here I've never seen before. I don't have an answer for it. What's the answer? And they'll either know or they won't know. If they don't know, then you have to stop and think, how important is it that we spend time on this? And you just have to evaluate, are they, because in a worst case scenario, Aaron, the grant application, because it's on hold until you get this question answered, right?
Yeah.
If it's some unanswerable question, God forbid, it's some unanswerable question, you have to abandon that application. If they don't come up with a good answer to this important question, they're screwed. They can't turn in that application. It's that important. So somebody has to weigh out, okay, here's this weird question. Here, is it hard for us to answer or easy? If it's easy to answer, we answer it. If it's hard for us to answer, what are we going to do about that? Right. And if they say, well, we don't have time to work on that, then that grant application might not be able to be turned in. But that's very rare. That's a worst case scenario. Very unlikely to happen. But I just wanted you to understand the process.
So those papers, that you wrote up for my mother, that's a grant, right?
That was actually a proposal.
That's okay.
Because they didn't give her any. They didn't give her any direction.
No guidelines.
They said send us your proposal, right? So I crafted a proposal that generally follows this outline, but it's not nearly as detailed. It's more conversational. It's 2 or 3 pages, and you're applying for a grant, but not through an online website, right? She's doing it more based on a relationship that she has than with some big funder that's requiring her to fill out a website.
So how often does that happen, or who should I?
That's the first one I've done in years. I mean, you don't see that very often. I want to see you just be a grant writer who goes to private foundations, fills out their application, and you get paid for doing that.
You broke up a little bit.
Okay. So we're down to this. Zoom is about to cut us off. We got like a minute. So I'm just saying, I want you to be a grant writer who gets paid to go onto website applications and fill them out. That thing that she did was sort of a one-off, project. I've never seen one quite like that before.
So you don't normally do proposals?
No. I mean, I can do them. I used to do them in business all the time, but not in nonprofits. Okay, we're out of time.
That's cool.
So think on all that, and we'll talk again soon, okay?
Alrighty.
Okay, praying for you.
Thank you, brother.
Okay, bye-bye.